Conversation as part of this lead up to Passover series here on Jewish Live. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I am here today with another previous guest on Judaism Unbound, on the Judaism Unbound podcast, Angie Thurston. She is the co-founder of an organization called the Sacred Design Lab, with another of our previous guests, Casper ter Kuile, and a third co-founder, which Angie can tell us a little bit about in a minute. And we are here to talk to Angie about, again, this question that we've been asking, how well, we know how this Passover is different from all other Passovers. The question is, what are we going to do about it? How might we do Passover in a way that won't make it only a bummer that this Passover is different in all these ways, that we know we can't get together with family in the same way, we can't maybe do the rituals in the same way, we might not even be able to get some of the ritual foods. We've been having some conversations over the last few days with B'nai Lappi, with Sarah Hurwitz, and other conversations where we talked a little bit more big picture. And the idea there was sort of, what kind of big picture questions can we talk about at the Passover Seder? Having a conversation is a major part of the Passover ritual, so we can actually do better on that this year, potentially, than in previous years. But the question of the rituals themselves, the various pieces of the traditional Seder that we might be used to, a lot of people are feeling kind of confused and bummed out and worried that we won't be able to do it this year in the same familiar way. And we thought that we could have a conversation today with Angie and tomorrow with Rebecca Milder, who are folks that are used to trying to actually reinvent rituals in more granular sorts of ways. And so that it might be a fruitful conversation to talk to somebody like you, Angie, who is actually an expert, such as there are any experts in online rituals, and that you might be able to help us a little bit to think about Passover in that regard. So before we jump into the question of Passover itself, could you just tell us a little bit about what the Sacred Design Lab is and what the story of its coming to be is?
Sure, you bet. Well, thanks, Dana, and I'm happy to be here with you. Sacred Design Lab is an organization that I started with Casper ter Kuile, as you mentioned, and my third colleague, Sue Phillips. And really what it's oriented around is bridging ancient wisdom with the kind of emerging challenges and world that we are facing. And so that means being in constant conversation with folks in the world of organized religion, and especially leaders, as well as with leaders who are doing things in spaces around innovative community and including secular community, that are kind of speaking into our culture now and helping people to find meaning and belonging and purpose in their lives. And so really asking, how can we strengthen what's emerging with the greatest wisdom that has come down to us through our traditions? And so we do that with all kinds of folks around the United States and across all different sectors.
And so how does that manifest practically? Like, do you have conversations about these topics, or do you do kind of workshops where you're actually reinventing things?
Yeah, we do three primary things. So the first is really just naming and framing the change that is happening and writing about it, speaking about it. So if you go to our website at sacred.design, you'll see we have 6 different reports there from the last 5 years or so that are really tracing changes in community, spirituality, and religion in the US. And then the second piece is, to your point, about trying stuff. So we do prototypes. We have an actual lab at Sacred Design Lab where we have gatherings around fascinating questions that people are living into right now. And we run pilot projects. So for instance, we ran an elder pilot for 6 months, connecting 40 innovative community leaders with 40 wise elders across religious traditions and outside of them, things like that. And then our third piece is partnering with organizations who are able to kind of deploy some of this ancient wisdom at scale. So those are, again, organizations that could be religious institutions, but are also institutions of higher education, tech organizations, civic organizations, healthcare organizations. So really looking at all the various places that this wisdom could live and thrive.
Could you say a little bit about, because I think that this is related to the question of Passover and what Passover is there to do, which is, when you say wisdom, can you talk a little bit about what the point of the wisdom is? Meaning, like, what is it that you see? And I think it's important for folks to understand that I'll say this in a simplistic way, but in various ways, you're trying to take wisdom from religious traditions, but to potentially deploy them in ways that are not only for religious people, and maybe not even primarily for, at least what we would classically think of as religious people. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious about if you could explain, why bother? What is it that there is so say, I've talked about it as that there's a user interface of religion, but underneath the kernel, or the thing that the user interface is trying to get at, is this thing that I call wisdom. I think you're calling it wisdom, the same thing. But could you help us understand a little bit about what that is, and why we need it, even if we're not religious?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. There's that line that's been variously attributed that says something like, don't seek to learn from the wise ones of old, seek what they sought,
Mm,
right? And it's this notion that, each of us in our own lives have an invitation and possibly a responsibility to make meaning of our experience, and to, kind of craft for ourselves a life that is connected to that of ultimate meaning and value. And so, when I think about the wisdom that has been handed down to us across centuries and across place, I think of it as the kind of the storehouse of the evidence from the ancestors of a life oriented around that inquiry.
mm,
What have they found? And that the more that we can kind of put our own experience in conversation with the experience of others and the experience of those who came before us, the more that it can help to guide our own pathways as we seek to do that ourselves.
mm,
Now, with that kind of said, that philosophic statement, in a slightly more practical way, religious traditions have been, and in many cases still are, the best distribution system for human meaning making in the history of the world.
mm,
Right?
mm.
And
That's a great way to
so
put it. Yeah.
part of what animates our project is noticing that more and more people, especially among younger generations, are less and less affiliated with organized religion, or they have relationships to organized religion which are hybrid and complex and involve, a kind of a lot of multiplicity, and also complex relationships with people in their lives who may not share the same identity, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so we can't necessarily rely on having a single religious identity or community that's going to provide the fullness of wisdom about how to live. And so a lot of people, and more people, are in a kind of choose your own adventure frame when it comes to living meaning making lives. And so that's really what we're, I guess, trying to help bridge, is when you are in that position and you don't have access to the full storehouse in a sort of clear and articulated way, how even do you begin to forge a path, and specifically that path be forged not alone, right? Because that's often one of the byproducts of disaffiliation, is that people end up pursuing spirituality alone,
Mm,
and that is impossible, actually. I think
mm,
it's certainly detrimental to the individual, but it can also butt up against the some of the core principles that people discover, which is like, oh, the spirit is not given to keep.
mm.
This has something to do with the way that I'm showing up in relationship and in my life. So that's, I guess, the groundwork of how I might begin to answer your question.
Well, I thought that your framing about the idea that I don't remember the exact words that you used, but that we're on the same quest as the ancients, we're asking the same questions, or we're trying to know what their questions were.
Right.
Um, I think that's very connected to the Passover Seder, which is structured around questions. There are the famous 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? Really, it's one question and 4 sort of sub questions or subparts.
Will you
But
tell me the questions, Dan?
if I can remember them off the top of my head, but it's basically, why is this night different from all other nights? But the idea is that you're supposed to do things that are provocative of the question. I mean, actually, we're going to get to, I think, that something that is completely lost on contemporary modern Jews, because they are reading the Passover out of a book. called the Haggadah. And it's become a practice to sit around the table and everybody's got a book in front of them and they're reading it. And that was not the traditional practice. The traditional practice, nobody could afford to have a book in their house. So it can't be the traditional practice. The traditional practice was to actually legitimately have questions. And Maimonides talks about how what a parent should do is kind of make all kinds of changes in the room on Passover Eve. So he talks about throwing nuts around the table. That's just his example. And his point is for the children to come into the room and say, why are there nuts everywhere? Why is this night different from all the other nights, right? That it's supposed to be an honest question that you have provoked by making things kind of topsy-turvy and surprising. But we've talked about how it feels like what our modern practice of Passover is, it's like as if once upon a time there was a wonderful cake and people asked how to make this cake and they gave them a cookbook and to show them this is how you make the cake. And then somehow the practice evolved such that the practice is now to sit around reading the cookbook and you never eat the cake. And the problem that people have gotten used to, I think, is that instead of actually having questions, we read these 4 questions, and they're basically the sub questions are, on this that why today we eat matzah and on other days we eat bread. On this day we eat we dip the herb, we dip the herbs once, but this time we dip it twice. And why do we sit in a reclined position this on Passover? And normally we sit up straight. There's certain, why do we eat bitter herbs today? And normally we don't eat, bitter herbs. And so it's sort of like on the one, so on the one hand, these questions were once upon a time legitimate questions where somebody who didn't know, and by the way, like this is when there's someone who's not Jewish who comes to the Seder, they might actually be asking these things. But most Jews have been to 42,000 Seders, and they're not actually, they're not really sure of the answer, but they're also not really asking the question. They're just asking that question because it's in the book to ask the question. So I guess, like, it's interesting. And there are also these other questions. There are a variety of other questions that are kind of strewn through the Haggadah in different ways. There's like 4 different kinds of children, and one asks a kind of what's supposedly a wise question, which is, what are all the rules of Passover? And another one is like supposed to be the wicked child who asks, like, what does this mean to you? And not to me. And there's a simple one who just says, what is this? And there's the one who doesn't even know how to ask a question. And there's all these questions, but they're not, I guess, like what my feeling is, my critique is that they're not sincere. And so in a way, not because anybody means them insincerely, but because people haven't been taught to ask sincere questions at the Seder. They've been taught to read these particular questions out of a book. And so I kind of wonder, right, for example, in a situation like this year, when it's by definition going to be different from all other Passovers, maybe there's an opportunity to truly ask questions.
Yes, well, we're certainly in a time where I think people are asking very difficult questions as it is, right? There's a sense of so much uncertainty that questions are very much alive in us at this time. And so I think you're absolutely right that if we wanted to, we could give those questions a place at the table during Passover this year, and to help that be some of what orients us, and of course, there is that connection between our current moment and the lineage of moments during which people have come together for Passover across history, right? So it's connected, and we're having a new experience that is bringing up new questions, as you say. Right. And so I think absolutely making room for those questions to be present in our space would be very appropriate.
Right. I should note, by the way, I didn't say this at the top of the show, but very intentionally, we're talking to you as someone who did not grow up Jewish, yes, because we are hoping to get insight from somebody who's looking at it from another perspective, which on the Judaism Unbound podcast, we've talked about a number of times, that particularly in times of upheaval in Judaism, but probably in all times, it's really helpful to get a perspective from somebody who isn't locked into certain ways of thinking because they grew up that way. And my experience over the last few weeks has been that it's really, really hard for Jews to be kind of curious and brainstormy about this coming Passover, because they're so locked into this idea, I can't do it the way we are supposed to do it, and that it would be really super helpful to get a perspective of somebody who's not stuck in that mindset. And so
well, hopefully I'll fit the bill. I am at least relatively Passover literate from
Right.
a fair number of life experiences. But yes, I'm certainly not locked in because I've had limited exposure to those experiences. So
Right. So, so I really hope that you'll be very free, at least in this hour, in giving your unsolicited, although I'm soliciting it, thoughts, because I think it'll really help people, because I think that people just kind of can't wrap their minds around that, that I can do it differently, but it's still okay. But actually, that leads me to a question about experience, or experience design in general, but I think also especially when there's changes happening. I know there are these kind of rules of thumb, like if you change too much, then the people kind of freak out. If you change too little, then it's not really a change. And I feel, I can't remember if it was, I heard 20%. Is that, like if you're doing you're trying to change the way we're doing Shabbat services, let's say, don't change the whole thing, just change 20% of it, and people can tolerate that. But if you change too much, then they'll react negatively. Is there a kind of a rule of thumb on that you work with? Or, the problem with this year is it's almost inevitable that it's almost 100%. Although I guess one of the questions is there a way to think about it where we're going to retain a lot of it, even if it's not so great over Zoom, but we're going to retain a lot of it because we have to, in order to give people the feeling of that it's still a Seder, but we can be free with 25%. How do you think about that?
yeah, well, I'd love to talk about that a little bit, specifically what you just mentioned about the part of this that feels out of our control. And I think what I would say is, if you're in a position of leading, right? So as if you have an identity as someone who typically would be leading a community, and that could even mean leading a family in a Seder experience, that I think one thing that's going to be really important this year is, because what we're about to talk about is all kinds of creativity that we could bring to bear. And
Hmm.
I'm excited about that because I know that we'll get to do lots of exploration. But I think we need to be in a certain mindset in order to play. Creativity is a kind of play. And
Hmm.
this, when you think about the fear stance, if you were to ask 100 people, like, express with your body what fear looks like, you would probably get a lot of people curling in on themselves, right? It's kind of the opposite of a stance of imagination and play. And so I think part of what's going to be important for anyone who is in the position of doing like creative ritual design around Passover this year, is that they really have an opportunity with some people in their lives. And ideally, it would be, either peers in the sense of other leaders who are kind of engaging in the same conundrum, or elders in their life, the people who they look to as inhabiting a way of being that they admire, to take an opportunity with peers or elders or both, to just be able to express any sorrow or other emotions that you're feeling as a leader about having to do it this way, which
Mm.
is not what you would have chosen. Because I think that step in this case is going to be really important before just diving into, okay, like, why, diving into imagination, and perhaps finding oneself like hitting up against it in the sense of, I don't feel like being creative because I'm grieving.
Hmm.
And so being able to have a bit of a lifeline with peers and elders is going to be important, probably throughout. And in part, that's because if you're leading in this kind of scenario, you don't want that to be what you're asking of the participants, that they be able to hold you in that experience, but that you're able to be giving in that space because you're resourced in another way.
I was gonna say, like, can I? Because I think that one of the fruitful things that we talked about with B'nai Lappi
Yeah.
previously is that in some ways the Exodus story, it maps very well onto our current situation, that there's a plague and we're all of a sudden thrust out of our usual spot and we're in the wilderness and it's chaotic and scary and we don't know what to do. And there's a wonderful story in the book of Exodus where Moses' father-in-law comes to give him some advice. And Benet and I talked about how the father-in-law is actually a man of the wilderness. So he's kind of a person who has been living out here and has some things to
Yeah.
say. But one of the things that he advises Moses, like, there's this famous advice about how to have a management structure, but there's this other piece of advice which is like, he's role modeling, where he asks Moses, how are things going? And Moses says, oh, it's been so hard. It's been, we had all these travails. And Jethro kind of hears the story and he says, implicitly, what are you talking about? Your God just saved you from slavery. You should be celebrating. And Jethro throws a huge party for the elders. And my take on that story has always been that Jethro is by role modeling, he's telling Moses to be a leader. You can talk to me, your mentor, and tell
Right.
me about all your travails, but
Right.
don't project that negativity to the people, because people can't follow you in that mindset, or they want, and that, so I guess what I'm saying is that I think, and I'm asking you if this is right, that and if this is what you're saying, that I think that those of us who are going to lead a Seder, we're also grieving, we're also confused, but when we're leading that Seder, we should try to project an air of happiness and excitement and exploration, as opposed to bringing everybody into this kind of, oh, this is so weird, or should we?
Yeah, well, I would say ideally, and this is where that community dimension is so important, if it's possible, and I hope that in many cases it will be, that even if you have just one other person in your life that can be a confidant about how you're feeling, and I think that's a great story to lift up. That, and it might be someone that you talk to 3 times, like a week before you're doing it, right before you're doing it, and right after you're doing it, just that you can be grounded and know that your experience is being held, so that really it's about being able to hold the experience of others. So I wouldn't say that it's about projecting something you don't feel, but that in that space you're able to bring out the authentic feelings that you have that are going to help hold them, essentially taking on a pastoral role in that
Right.
environment, right? That you're able to do that, but that ideally it wouldn't come at your own expense, right? Because you yourself would be resourced, just not in that space.
Right.
Because that, I think, would be asking too much of the people that you're helping to bring together, and probably to bring together virtually, to ask them to also hold you in your grief, if that makes
Right.
sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm not sure if the best sort of step for us to go is to talk about Passover and how we might digitize them, or to talk about your principles and how you think about online rituals. But maybe that's a better place to start, and just for
Yeah.
you to give us a little bit of general grounding, and like how, in general, how we think about online rituals in a positive way, and maybe what can they do that even in person doesn't do, and can we give some initial thoughts on, well, what might be good about this, and then maybe we can try to map that onto the Passover rituals.
I think that sounds great. And so I'll just say, by way of introduction, that at Sacred Design Lab, we ourselves have been very fascinated about the question of how to conduct ritual online, from before the pandemic. And so we've done a fair amount of that experimentation ourselves. We also tend to just be in conversation with religious and community innovators. And so we've gotten exposed to a lot of ritual innovation in online spaces as well. And so it it felt appropriate under the circumstances for us to attempt to codify some of the principles that we've distilled from that experience. And so I will hasten to say that these are by no means exhaustive. And all of us, just in general, all of these tools that we have at our disposal are still quite new when in the scheme of things. And so my hope is that, in the years to come, there will be even more robust experience and resource available for people who are trying to conduct ritual in creative ways and incorporating online dimension. But for now, we've attempted to share just 5 principles of online ritual that I would love to kind of run through, and then to think with you, Dan, about how these might be meaningfully applied to Passover. And I don't know if there's a way, perhaps after we talk, that you'd be able to share them in writing. We just wrote them up in 2 pages, so that might be helpful for folks.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I have like I think I have a 4-page version.
Oh, is it 4 pages? Oops. Yeah, I think it is.
Oh, well, I mean, I can share my screen if would that be helpful, or would it be better just to talk and then
Sorry.
and we no, I'm saying that I can share those on my screen if you would want me to right now in the meeting, or you can just talk about them and then we can put a link. You can send us a link and we can put it in later.
Okay. Well,
Whatever you think is best.
if most folks are going to be watching this, after we're recording live, then I think,
Yeah,
as long as they have the link that they can reference, then we can just have our conversation alongside that.
great. So
Yeah.
we'll do that.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just kind of give maybe the highest level about each of these 5 principles, and then maybe we can decide which ones we want to dive into and how much,
Perfect.
if that makes sense. Okay. So the first one is to make a space. And what we mean by that is basically that as a leader and frankly as a participant, but focusing for a moment on leaders, the real environment that you're in is going to affect you and those that you're with, even if they're with you virtually. And so, given that this is going to impact how you feel when you're creating an online ritual environment, to the extent that it's in your control, do your best to create a space that's going to be conducive to the inner state that you'd like others to have during this ritual. And so that can be through your decor of photographs and plants and books and furniture. It might be your own clothing or jewelry, what you're wearing for the ritual. And even if a lot of that is not in your control or you don't have the means to do that, on video, et cetera, it can be it is always, I think, important to do your best to prepare your inner environment before an online ritual. And so that's a little bit what we were just talking about with, elders and mentors, but also in terms of your own practices you may have, or intentions that you might want to set, even frankly, a few deep breaths before you join the call.
Can I ask you on the much more prosaic version? I mean, like now, we've discovered early on in using Zoom a lot is that you can do things like this, where you can, and I'm thinking like there's some presets here in Zoom, but I would imagine that if you searched around a little, you could find like a desert scene, for example, and if you're trying to talk about like the exit, this is a more of a desert island, but that potentially you could find some kind of scene and even maybe ask everybody on Zoom to put the same scene in back of them, and you could somehow feel either that we're in the wilderness together, like on the Passover story, or in Egypt or something, right? You could things
Sure.
like that.
Sure. I mean, there's really no end to where we could go with it. Yeah. I mean, that's a great idea. I think, depending what people are organizing, it could be that, we're doing Passover with my family and your family and 3 other families, in which case we might have a number of us who are sharing space. And so in that case, you might go a different route, right?
Uh-huh.
Because you might be blanking out the others in the room with the palm tree there. But but I think that's absolutely right. And I should have said, before even sharing that first principle, while we are in a context where all of this is happening amidst hardship, I think it's also a pretty remarkable and unprecedented opportunity to extend the reach and capacity of ritual to online participation. And that opens up a lot of opportunities to cross barriers that otherwise would be there. So whether that's by geography, whether that's by generation, there's real possibility here that I think once we kind of hold the grief and loss we're feeling in conversation with that creative play, we can really make a lot of discoveries there. So the second principle, and again, we can go into any and all of these in greater depth, but has to do with marking time. And so when we're in real space together, a lot of the time that happens kind of naturally, like, oh, we've all sat down, or oh, there's a sense of just by the way our bodies move in space, whether something has begun and when it has ended. But in a virtual environment, we need to do a little bit more work to make that happen. So, for a good ritual experience, it's creating a frame. It's inviting you into a time out of time, what our friend Ida would talk about as a magic circle. And so when we're together, we should feel like we've entered the magic circle. And then when it's over, we should know that it's closed, that we're no longer in it. And so part of what needs to be done in an online environment is to create that frame by marking a beginning and an end. And so that can happen in many ways that we can talk about, but especially things like breath are often helpful, kind of breathing life into a virtual space, even if we just each breathe together at the beginning and the end. things like that, and I'm sure that a lot of what already exists in the Passover Seder could be meaningfully deployed for this purpose.
But you mean it's not just saying like, okay, let's begin the Seder. It's like, okay, everybody, let's collect ourselves. Let's, do something, whether we all breathe together. That's something that marks kind of a formal beginning that
That's right.
maybe has silence on both sides of it.
Yeah, let's become present here together, right? Recognizing that our bodies are not together in space. How can we be together and know that we are? And so, for instance, in a daily reflective time that we've been leading on Zoom during the pandemic, we will just have, well, we actually do silence first, but then we also have everyone light a candle where they are. And so, and they might put in the chat, like candle lit in Alexandria, candle lit in Tacoma. And so things like, and then we blow it out at the end and we all catch the smoke. So things like that, where we know it's begun, the candle is lit, and we know it's ended because we've blown it out, that kind of
Well,
thing.
it's interesting too, because it makes me even just think of the traditional Seder, like you said, having that built in. I mean, there's the two first things that you do in the traditional Seder is you say the blessing over wine, the Kiddush, which is really where usually one leader is saying it and everybody else is silent, but it gives a kind of a beginning. But then the other thing is that the second thing that you do in the traditional Seder is a ceremonial hand washing, which this year seems quite appropriate.
Yes, it does.
But often what people do, I think, partly because like everybody's at the table and everybody just squeezed into the table, so it's hard for everybody to move around. Often in people's seders, somebody goes to ritually wash their hands as like the delegate of the community, in a way. But this year, I could imagine that the more traditional way, where usually it's a basin of water, is passed along with like a scooper, and people kind of wash into the, like, to actually do that is much more feasible when it's really just 4 people here and 4 people on Zoom over there and 4 people on Zoom over there. And actually everybody could do that in a relatively short amount of time. And maybe that hand washing would both be related to the times that we're living in, and also giving this mark of time and space. Like we're entering the magic circle by first washing away what really ought to be washed away, which is any traces of the outside world that's scary.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it dovetails perfectly into the third principle, which is use real things. So I think you're hitting on it. I mean, we led a ritual where everyone brought a cup and a bowl, and the cup was full of water. And then it was symbolic in that particular context of moving from one container to another, and then we drank the water after that. So that was a different ritual, but it employed real water, and a real cup and a real bowl, and everyone's doing it where they are at the same time. And so I think you're absolutely right that having the ritual hand washing occurring across space, with multiple families at once would be so beautiful and powerful as a way into that. And I think in general, just not to forget that while we're gathered virtually, each of us is embodied where we are, and that ritual is so much more powerful when each participant is having a real sensory experience. And, we can talk about, obviously, I know there are challenges to some of the particularity this year with people not necessarily having access to exactly what they usually would. So we'll have to think creatively about that. Right. But that being said, I think you can go a long way with what people do have access to, and allow for whatever might have been kind of experienced in the more traditional Passover together in whole new ways. And part of that has to do with using real things, and those things, because people are in their homes, you can find even that everyone has meaningful versions of the things at hand, right? So that this candle is special to me because this cloth I'm wearing is special to me because, this vessel that is holding my drink is special to me because, so you have the specialness and the participatory nature. And this gets to the fourth principle, which
before you get to the fourth, I just want to just to like double down just on what you're saying. It's really taking me in a direction that's in a way the opposite of what I imagined I was going to be thinking about, but I think it's great, which is that I think a lot of us are thinking, hey, we don't have access to the same foods maybe, or maybe we do, but we're not sharing them. And so we need to do something different. But in a way, what I'm hearing in what you're talking about is the possibility that, no, we actually want to double down on that and say, when we're doing the Seder the regular way, a lot of these rituals, like the hand washing and some of the foods, they're almost like passing by us very quickly, and it's not even registering.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas to actually do it in this way and to say, wait a second, like as I was listening to you, I was like, wait a second, the Passover Seder is already doing a lot of the things that you're saying. It's
It is.
already
Yeah.
really full of these like tangible things. And so what if we actually just said, hey, let's slow the whole thing down and let's say, let's really savor these foods. Let's really do that hand washing. Let's not just have dad go and do it. Let's have everybody really do it, and not only do it, but do it slowly and seriously. And maybe you actually like just dig deep into what's already there. And so
Yeah.
that's really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, one asterisk to that is that if you are in an organizing or leading or designing position, that dimension will require a little preparation for everyone involved, right? So making sure that you take the time to ask people in advance to have these things ready
Right.
for when you're all going to gather online, which is easy enough to do. But what you don't want to have is to have everyone scurrying around their home trying to collect everything
Right.
when it starts. So that'll be it. That'll be a key. But yeah, I think that's right, Dan. I mean, we can still be creative with what the things are, but
Right.
I think you're right that very much so we could use what is already built into this tradition from our homes. Yeah.
Right.
So
Okay, the
briefly,
fourth one.
yeah, it's a good one.
No, I said the fourth one. Now we're ready for the fourth
One
one.
is lean into the new, and that's about playing to the strengths of this format. So again, recognizing the loss in that online gatherings are not the same as in-person gatherings, but also for the creative purposes, kind of reframing to say online ritual is a different medium entirely. And so for the creative purpose, it's not to think of it as a less good version of the real world, but actually to think of it as a new category of experience and one that's just being developed. So we really have a chance to create the traditions of the future, which is not to say that we'll be like online under duress for the rest of our lives, but just that this is a whole new playground, and that some aspects of it are genuinely very powerful. People can connect across vast distances, including people with limited mobility who couldn't otherwise participate, right? You have this dimension that's just come up where the fact that we're all in our personal environments means that it can be dramatically more participatory, in the sense that instead of all relying on the one leader who's going to do everything for us, now we're all called upon, to show up and to craft and co-create our experience together, things like that. So there's a lot to lean into.
Right.
And then just briefly on the last one is about helping us connect. So, just that it's easy to suspect that our distance means disconnection, right? And the kind of loss of, well, we always come together in this one person's home for Passover, right? And the fact that that's not possible is bringing us apart. And I think, our hope with these principles is to help animate the imagination around, okay, how can we connect at distance through this ritual? And I think we can get into it if you want, Dan, but there are some ways that, depending on the platforms that you're using and the kind of format you develop for the ritual, there can be ways to, again, sort of deploy its strengths to help deepen connection. Because emphatically, I have experienced that with a little guidance and some creativity, these platforms really can facilitate not just connection, but like religious experience, for
Right.
people to meaningfully connect not only with each other, but with their deepest sense of meaning and their connection to something beyond themselves.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that like just this is I'm no kind of historian, but this is my sort of take on the recent history, by which I mean the post-Enlightenment history of the Jews over the last 100, 200 years, is that what? Just a
No,
little thing.
I'm anticipating what you might say.
No, just a little. No, which is just that before the Enlightenment, there was a very small minority of Jews who were well educated. Those were rabbis, and they had a very sophisticated understanding of what Passover was supposed to be, and they wrote a lot of sophisticated books about it, like Maimonides did. And you could imagine in this little gathering, there was a really serious undertaking going on. I think for the vast majority of people who were uneducated, it was kind of like, these are the rituals that you should do. And yeah, we know it's about that we're remembering the slavery in Egypt and that we were freed, but I don't know that there was like tremendous sophistication about it. Then after the Enlightenment, a large majority of Jews became very well educated. And for some reason but I think because at the same time there was the printing press, and there was a cheaper books, that all of a sudden, at a moment where maybe the Jews as a large people could have become very sophisticated and creative about the Passover ritual, because of the printing press, all of a sudden they became less creative, because all of a sudden everybody could have the book. And then you think that what we're supposed to do at Passover is a ritual that is required, that somebody else told me to do, and we should do it the right way. In a very specific way, as opposed to the right way being that we should accomplish the big picture goals of Passover. And the big picture goals of Passover are really clear in a lot of the writings of the Mishnah, which is the original book of Jewish law that prescribed the mechanics of the Seder, which are actually very sketchy. There's not that many things that are absolutely required. And the big picture requirement is that each and every generation, every person should see him or herself, themselves, as if they personally left Egypt, meaning that it's not a remembrance of our ancestors having left Egypt. It's somehow a change in our nature, so that we ourselves are now a person who left Egypt, even though it was 2,000 years ago. And then the question about why, that's a little bit controversial. You could say that in the beginning it was because then we'll be more grateful to God, right? Because if we ourselves were a slave that was freed, as opposed to our ancestors 2,000 years ago, where then maybe we'll have a more direct sense that God helped us. And now, even though we're still kind of struggling in our lives a little, but we can still pray to God and hope to God and believe that God will save us. That's one take on it. And I think that the more prosperous, sort of higher end Maslow hierarchy of needs take on it is, now that we're doing okay, maybe if we believe that we ourselves were slaves who were freed, we'll understand that we have a sacred obligation to help others who are still enslaved, or who are in other ways struggling and impoverished. Either of which in some way is like a beautiful take. But at the end of the day, I don't know too many Jews in my lifetime that will say, in fact, I'm pretty sure I know zero, that will say, oh yeah, that's what happens to me every year at the Passover Seder. That I come out of there feeling like I myself was a freed slave, and therefore either I feel more dedication to God, or I feel more dedication to being a kind of person who is going to help others. I think they all know intellectually, or many people know intellectually, that's what I'm supposed to get out of it. And so maybe I'm reminded of that. And so I'm thinking about it a little more than usual, but not that I've had this transformational experience. And when you were talking about like the magic circle, right, that we're creating a space here, and it's a magical space, and we're going to come into it with a certain intention, and we're going to leave it with a certain intention. I actually think that's what the Seder is trying to do, and has been a pretty abject failure in doing that. And the reason why people like Passover so much is much more to do with the family gathering, the Thanksgiving dimension of Passover. And the ritual sort of feels like something that we do. Yeah, we have like fond memories of it, nostalgia, but it's not actually working as a magical experience. And so I sort of wonder if there's opportunities this year, because the Thanksgiving piece is somewhat reduced, and and we can't do things the same old way, that maybe we can figure out how to create a truly magical experience where that transformation to be freed slaves is actually happening.
Oh, if ever there was a time, this is the time.
Right. So I guess like my question is like, so the way that I think that Seder tries to accomplish that is through two major tools. One is these foods that we eat, and that we, in some way, people think of them as symbolic. I don't actually think of them as symbolic. I think they're trying to do something akin to what the Eucharist tries to do, which is to say that, no, actually, by taking these foods into your body, it enacts the magic.
Mm.
you are what you eat, and that by eating these foods that remind us of tears and bitterness and the bread of affliction, as you eat them, you are being transformed. And I think that that's generally not happening. People are experiencing them as symbolic and therefore not that powerful. And the other way is through conversation, through retelling this story, and in some way hopefully telling the story in a way that we sort of it sinks deeply into us somehow. But again, I don't think it works. I think it's like reading the cookbook instead of eating the cake. And so I wonder if those goals bring to mind ideas for you as to how we might use this as an opportunity to actually do the thing that the Seder's been failing to do for the last 2,000 years, which is to do what its intention is, which is that we should leave on the other end of it with this powerful sense that we ourselves were freed from slavery, and now we have something to do for the rest of the year because of that experience.
Well, it does bring things to mind. So Ida Benedetto, who's referenced in the document that you'll be linking, she's an experienced designer who uses that phrase magic circle. And one of the things that she talks about through her own research and experience is that to enter the magic circle must take risk. That risk is a necessary ingredient in transformation. And so I think you're right. And Dan, it's certainly not exclusive to the Passover. I think in many, many contexts across religious traditions, we lose sight of the actual alchemy that has been asked of us through these rituals, and they can become rote, they can cease to carry the meaning. So that's certainly not unique to this one in particular, right? That's a trend that happens over time where things can calcify. So I think that one of the things that gets lost is the element of risk. And it might seem crazy right now when everything seems like it's so uncertain to then go introduce risk into something like this. But I guess some of the ways I might imagine that in this context would be, and this is very Brene Brown, connecting vulnerability to courage, right? But is that if people are bringing more of themselves personally to this space, it's definitely going to be more vulnerable and therefore more risky and therefore more potentially transformative. And so, I think of something as simple as, as we're going through this plague, as it were, and we have the opportunity through this particular ritual to feel connected to our ancestors who have endured great hardship, and to recognize that this is not the first time, and nor will it be the last, right, that we endure hardship. And so, that might be something where we ask ourselves personally, whether it's an ancestor that we connect with through history and story, or whether it's someone in our own lives who has inspired us by the way that they have moved through hardship, and why. What is that story? And to maybe incorporate some of that personal reflection and or sharing into the ritual experience this year, and that might involve also some kind of commitment that someone might say, inspired by the courage of, my grandmother Ingrid. I'll use my own example. Like my grandmother Ingrid, this is the Jewish side of my family. Lived through, fled Germany during the Holocaust and cared for her mother in a convent in Morocco, right? And then moved to the United States at 19 and taught English or French rather. So I have her story, and what is the quality about her? Maybe it's her tenaciousness. That I would bring her tenaciousness into the circle and say, I am challenging myself to move through this experience with more tenaciousness. What does that mean to me? And given that you might have, I'm just making things up, of course, but that you might have groups of families who are meeting together on Zoom, right? That maybe there are periods through the night where the family might turn to each other and have a conversation of like, what are each of us bringing? And then we would share it in the chat box if we're on Zoom or something like this, or we can, if we're on Zoom or another video platform, we could use breakout sessions, which, comes with most of the platforms, where you then would have small groups have a conversation during the meal. And you might mix up people from different families getting to have a small group conversation. So just things like this that allow for people's personal expression to enter into the circle, I think are going to be part of what might help yield that transformative quality. And especially if you connect it to taking in the foods, which, already the ritual is doing that, right? But how can we help to bring that into a more personal space for each individual? Like, what are the bitter herbs doing in my own, in the way that I myself am navigating this time? So things like that, I think, would help to imbue what might have become a little bit rote, with some more of that personal dimension.
And as I'm listening to you so far, here's what I've got in my head, and I'm trying to like sort of design this on the fly as I'm listening to you. And I know it's not everything that you're saying, but I'm saying, like, part one, everybody have a Zoom background that puts us in a particular space, and we'll also decorate the room in our different houses. Let's say we have 4 families and they're in 4 different places. I'm imagining that we plan in advance, everybody decorate the room, to be like the desert or whatever, and we're all going to use Zoom backgrounds for that. Then my sister, who I think is generally annoyed that I don't quote her enough on the podcast, because I think I say things about my other sister. So I'm going to say for the sister who actually, so her family, this is before this Passover, they've, for the last few years with their friends, they've actually been having costumes for the Passover Seder.
Nice.
And they're all together, but they come in costume and either as like Israelites with, robes and staffs and whatnot, or as Egyptians, with Egyptian makeup and the Pharaoh hat and all that kind of thing. And so I'm thinking like costumes is definitely something that would really work, especially in we're seeing the creativity of everybody in their different Zoom spaces, who's come in a costume. So somehow you're creating this sense that like we actually are on in a trip through history, right? Like we actually are going to this time. And I guess the question is, maybe once we're already doing that with the space and with our costumes, then even if we're eating the same foods, maybe they take on a certain new valence, because it's one thing to eat matzah when I'm dressed in my Western clothes and we're just kind of, it's kind of fake. At the point at which I am all dressed up as a Israelite and the house looks a little bit, deserty, and then I'm eating matzah, you start to feel like, oh, this is actually more, this is helping me get into character. This is part of like the people who are using the method, the method acting, like they really try to do the things so like I'm starting to get this sense of like place and all that. And and then some of the food, it feels like some of the foods, I think that people are thinking about the foods like traditionally you're supposed to have a bitter herb, where a lot of people, for example, have horseradish.
Right.
And I don't know, I mean, maybe some people have horseradish in their house. Maybe you can still go out to the local supermarket and get a canned horseradish. But to the extent that people are used to having a chopped up horseradish, maybe that's hard to get. I'm not totally sure, because I'm not going out to the grocery store as much as possible, which I think is true of a lot of people. So I'm wondering, like, maybe, okay, we don't have to have horseradish. Maybe there's a way to experience that the horseradish is meant to either be a symbol or, like I was saying earlier, a food that you take in and it actually embitters you, right? But the idea is to somehow kinesthetically experience bitterness. So I'm thinking, for example, like maybe we could just sit, like stand in some uncomfortable position, right? Or maybe there are other ways to, again, like I'm going to this question of like, people are used to thinking that the Seder these are things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to eat horseradish, as opposed to I'm supposed to feel bitter. Right. And so maybe there are other ways, better ways maybe to feel bitter.
I mean, literally this year, it could be the very fact of not having access to the things that I'm used to having is the origin of my bitterness, that I don't have horseradish this year.
Right.
And that absence is standing in for the bitterness of the herb itself. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a wide range of creative possibility as long as we give ourselves the permission. And I think that can be a key impediment that I just want to name is the sense, I call it spiritual permission, but the sense that we even have a right to iterate on what has been handed down to us. And so I would definitely be one out saying every tradition was once an innovation. And these innovations usually happened out of a sense of necessity. And so from my perspective, it is entirely right that we should do this. Obviously, there are many perspectives on that, but to the extent that it might be a struggle to grant internal permission to do this kind of creative play. I think that's just something that's going to be important for anyone who is convening others this year to bear in mind, that they themselves might come up against it, and that the people they're gathering might come up against it too. That sense within themselves of, oh, we're not allowed to do this, or this can't quite be, accurate to the tradition that we've received. And my sense is that nothing could be more faithful than to apply our own creative and spiritual energy to the ritual itself.
Right, and that's where, like, who am I to give anyone permission? I think that's the question. But to the extent that I'm anyone, like, the point of this show, the point of this endeavor is to give that permission. And what's really interesting is that I've been hearing from a lot of rabbis who you might have imagined a year ago wouldn't have given so much permission so freely, that a lot of folks are giving a lot of permission this year, that says, like, none of us really knows the best way to do it. There are a lot of, I mean, even the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbi of Israel gave permission to use Zoom for Passover, even though, according to them, they don't use electronics on the holiday. They say you have to turn it on in advance. You can't actually turn it on. So you have to have the Zoom running from before the holiday. But actually a pretty big departure from their typical rules and regulations. And so, I think that this year, I don't know. I guess the question also about ritual design is sort of back to that 20% versus 80% question, is like, if we tell people, look, it's pretty sure that a year from now, this coronavirus business will be over. So if you want, in a year from now, you can go back to Passover as you had it before. Maybe it's okay to have 1 year Passover that's experimental. That even if it wasn't the coronavirus, like maybe just once in a lifetime, it's okay to say, let's try it, let's experiment, and let's see how it works. And this is by no one's choice. This is the year. So it would just seem like maybe we can sort of get ourselves to that place of permission in one way or the other. Sometimes it's hard for me to because I never feel the lack of permission. So sometimes I feel like don't know how to get somebody else to feel it. But maybe in a year like this, where no one really knows the right way to do it, it's a year where people can feel more permission.
I hope so. And to really be, allow ourselves to be moved by what occurs that we never could have anticipated. And of course, this is not the situation that we would have desired. But the fact that we might be able to have Passover with family members who would never be able to be in our homes because of where they live or other extenuating circumstances, but that we could actually be together and celebrate together in, yes, a virtual way, but that the alternative would be not at all, right? So the fact that we'd be able to do that together could be so meaningful. And I think, a lot of what you're suggesting, Dan, around incorporating these more creative dimensions, it could end up being a very special Passover experience, and one that we're all going to remember for the rest of our lives, and sure, there might be bad reasons why that's true because of the circumstances, but there might also be really beautiful reasons that we come out of this saying, wow, that was one of the most moving Passover experiences I've ever had. Right. I think it's wholly possible.
Right.
And so I really encourage people to just, not be afraid of this opportunity to try something.
Yeah, and I would also, right, and along similar lines, I would also just say to people, look, if you've really been getting a lot out of your Passover Seders in the past years, like you've really been transformed, like it might be a bummer for you this year, but I would suggest that probably nobody listening to this is going to be in that position where they're going to say, oh yeah, Passover is really working. I mean, the Seder was really working for me on a spiritual level, and I think most of the people watching this are going to be like, yeah, actually, I would want to try out some new things because maybe I could actually get it to work for me. And like, this would be the year. And I totally agree. It might be one to remember. And not only that, it might be one where next year rolls along and you say, you know what, I'd rather do it the way I did it this year, and maybe it's the beginning of the creation of something really new and profound. So thanks for helping us frame some of the right questions to be asking, which is very much in the Passover tradition.
Well, I'm honored to have any part of the tradition.
This is great. And so is there like a way, are there ways that people can explore what you do beyond the link that we're going to share? Like, are there places to go to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the best place is just the website, which is sacred.design. And then within that site, the page on insights is where we've housed all of our reports, and folks can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out about once a month and just contains some of our latest thinking about how things are changing, resources, ideas, inspiring projects, things like that. So that's probably the best place to head.
Well, thanks, Andrew Thurston. This was so great. This is, I think it was exactly at least for me, it's exactly got my mind spinning in the direction that I was needing somebody to help me get there, which is to,
Oh,
on
so
the practical side, how are we really going to play around with some of the practices and make them really meaningful? And I think I'm leaving here feeling really energized about it. And I hope people watching will also. So thank you so much for guiding us.
Oh gosh, well, I hope so too. And it's been really fun to talk to you about it, Dan. So thank you again for all you're doing to help folks in this time where it's really needed.
Thank you.
Yeah.